All right, thank you for coming to the May Garden Talk. Annette Super will be doing bees native to Western New York. So, Annette, I'm just going to turn it over to you and you can get started.
Okay, thank you, Jan. I'm glad you all came. I hope you don't know a whole lot about native bees, and so that maybe I can tell you something you don't know. Last fall, Jan was filling the slots for the talk, and she said, "Does someone want to do native bees?" And I thought, well, that can't be hard. So I raised my hand. I knew nothing about native bees. And as I've read over the past couple of months, I found out.
Can you speak up?
Speak up. Okay. Over the past couple of months, as I've read different books and articles and online, I've learned an awful lot about native bees. So maybe I can. So when you hear the word bee, what do you think of?
Sting.
Pardon?
Sting.
Sting.
Honeybees.
Honey.
Bumblebee.
Bumblebee. Okay. Most people think of a honeybee when they think of a bee, but it might surprise you that honeybees are not native to our country, to North America. In fact, they were brought over by colonists because they were effective pollinators. They made honey and they would pollinate the crops that they brought over. Honeybees live in large nests and they make honey. And an interesting fact is when you hear about a bear raiding a honeybee nest, he's after the larvae. He's not after the honey. He wants the protein in the larvae. So, so why do native bees matter? Well, native bees pollinate many, many things. They pollinate apples, blueberries, and squash. They pollinate wildflowers and forest plants. They support a food web. I know when I was in school, we were always told about a food chain, the people at the bottom, the animals or whatever at the bottom, plants all the way up to the predator on the top. But actually food webs, they're very interrelated. The plants need the bees need the plants. So it's more of a web than a chain. Also, native bees are much more efficient pollinators than honeybees. Sorry about my cough. Okay, so New York State has about 400 species of native bees. Over the world, there's 20,000. There's a lot of native bees. Western New York supports hundreds of them because we have meadows, forest edges. We have meadows, we have grasslands, we have wetlands, and we have urban gardens and parks. And when you think of the gardens, not only city gardens, but the gardens in rural areas and suburbia, wherever you are, if you have a garden, you can support a native bee. Unlike honeybees, native bees are solitary. That means they live alone. They don't live in large hives. Now, whenever I talk about native bees, it's usually or in general because there are so many different varieties that everyone is different. When we talk about honeybee, we all know what a honeybee is. They live in a hive. They have the different bees that take part in the hive. But when you're talking about a native bee, because you have so many different kinds, you have a lot of different styles. Most native bees are single mothers. They do all the work themselves. They are mated, the male flies off, and the mother is left to do all the work. Most native bees collect pollen to feed their young, and they produce very little honey. Some produce honey, but it's not like the honey that honeybees make. It's a very different honey, and it's used by them. And an interesting fact is when a bee flies, they create a positive charge on the hairs that attract the negatively charged pollen of the plants. The pollen is rich, the sperm rich in proteins, amino acids, and fats.
Can you say that again? Can I go back or just do it again?
Which one?
Yeah,
This one?
so what's pollens is, so what's the reason that they do the positive change, the check?
Well, in order to make the pollen stick to them, the pollen is negative, and when they fly, have you ever rubbed a balloon on your head and stuck it on the wall?
Yeah.
It's the
Okay.
same kind of idea. It's creating a charge, and then it can attract the pollen and have the pollen stick. So Linnaeus, the Linnaean system of classification, was established in the 18th century, and it categorizes living organizations by a group based on their characteristics. And one of the significant contributions is the binomial nomenclature, a two-part naming system, which each species is given a name consistent, each animal is given a name consistent of a genus and a species. And just as we've been taught in master gardening, that if we have a plant, we might have very many different common names for it, but there's only one Latin name or official scientific name. So it's good to use them when you're referring to plants or animals. So this is just a general breakdown of the, I'm not even up with my notes, of the hierarchy for bees. And in this case, we have the animal kingdom, we have arthropodia, we have insects, we have the order, which I'm not going to try to say, and then we have the clade, which is all bees. And then these are the different kinds of bees. And notice that in this one family, we have our honeybees and our bumblebees, which might give you an idea that maybe they have something in common. So then this is the family tree, for any other name, for the bumblebee, the common bumblebee that we have. And notice that we go all the way down, and when we get to the family, and then we get to the bumblebees. If you go out to Cornell's website on bees, you'll find a spreadsheet out there. And if you're a nerd like me, you'll love spreadsheets because you can do all sorts of filtering on them. And so this is a little screenshot of part of the spreadsheet. And you'll notice that they give, and I don't know why they did this order, but they did. But they give the family, the subfamily, and then the family, and then the subgenus and the scientific name, which is made up the genus and the species. So for this bee, his genus and his subgenus are both Bombus. But for this bee, his genus is Bombus, but he has a different, this one here, but he has a different subgenus. So just again, very careful identification so that they can identify these bees.
Are you gonna get to the point that they have different colors or something?
We will.
Okay, I just wondered. I didn't know if they did or not.
Yep. Here we go.
There they are.
Got to the point. So native bees come in all sorts of colors, sizes, shapes, and mostly they're hairy. Mostly they have a defined waist. They're pretty compact. They have pollen collecting structures. Not all of them do, but most of them do. They have branched hairs, which helps collect pollen, and they have a protein diet. They live off of the protein, and the pollen is protein. Remember we said when we talked about the pollen. And these, this is taken from a bee's website in Minnesota, which is a very nice website. So here's a bee, just a random generic bee. And we just want to point out that they have 3 small eyes on the top of their head, even though that picture looks like they have 4. This is generated by AI, and AI doesn't know everything, I guess. And they're used to detect light intensity and help with their orientation by navigating, stabilizing light. They also have these 2 big compound eyes, and those are the ones you see. And they detect movement, shapes, and colors, which is very important when you start picking out your plants for bees. They have hairs on them, And they have, I guess that's all we can see. So this is basically the head area. And so here we're looking at the bee from the back, and we can see he has a thorax, the defined waist, and then he has a abdomen. All of his legs and wings, like all other insects, are attached to his thorax. The wings are transparent, they're veined, and actually these veins are used in the identification of bees. They have a special name, which I have forgotten what it is, but so when you're looking at a bee, you can look at the wing and see the pattern on it, and that helps you identify it. They also have breathing tubes, and they have an ovipositor. That's the part of the bee that stings, and it's only on the female, so only the females sting. So this is a shout out to Heather Holm. She has a website where she has beautiful, beautiful pictures of bees. And on her website, she says, as long as you put her name on your presentation, you can use her pictures, which is so nice to find pictures that I can use legally. So we're going to talk about different types of native bees. And when I started this, I asked AI. AI helped me a lot on this. You know, what are the types of bees? And they gave me a list of types of bees. And then I did a shout out, or Jan did, to all the the master gardeners and said, do you have pictures of bees? And many of them responded with pictures. So I thought, well, since there's 400 bees and there's only an hour, maybe maybe I should limit it in some way. So I decided to talk about bees that have pictures taken by our Genesee County native, I'm going to call them native gardeners, master gardeners, because that tells us that they are really here. You know, if someone here in our area is taking the picture. So first we had the mining bees, and I had AI generate these little pictures. And these are very common in Western New York. They nest in the soil. They usually like sandy or loose soil. They often nest in aggregation. In other words, there's a whole lot of nests together, but every bee has her own nest. They don't share nests. So it's like a big condo. They're active in spring, and they are non-aggressive. Most native bees will not sting you unless you startle them or handle them roughly. And in fact, when they were studying digger bees or ground nesting bees, they went to a school where there were a lot of bees, and the kids said, oh yeah, those are the tickle bees. So these little kids had known that these bees were out there, and they were just part of the playground, and they didn't bother anybody. So first bee we're going to look at is the hairy branded bee. And these are taken from that spreadsheet I showed you earlier. So this will tell us exactly what the family tree of it is. And it also tells us that this bee is a specialist. That means that there are only certain plants that this bee will visit, which means it's very important that we plant in our gardens the plants that these native bees like. A honeybee is a generalist. The honeybee will go to any flower out there. But many, but not all, of our native bees are specialists. Now, also on that spreadsheet, it tells the vulnerability of these bees. And so this one is a 3-4 rating, so they couldn't really make up their mind. So it's either secure or it might be vulnerable. So the life cycle of this bee is in the spring, the males and the females emerge from the ground. You'll see them coming out of the ground, and they'll mate. Then the female bee will prepare a nest. She'll dig a hole and they'll branch out. So the hole will go down, and then she'll branch out, and she'll go and collect the pollen and what she needs, and she'll make a pollen ball in the nest, and then she'll lay an egg on it, and then she'll go collect more pollen, and she'll do this until she's done. Often the life cycle, the adult active cycle, of a bee is very short. It might only be 2-3 weeks. Then she'll incubate the eggs and the larval will develop, and then they go into pupation and dormancy. And then it waits till next spring until they can start flying again. So this is the bee. This picture on the left was taken by Jan, I think on her mother's windowsill or something.
Oh, really? Yes,
Yeah.
really.
This is a female. And then we have,
Can you go back and show us why that's a female?
I don't know why it's a female. I know it's a female because it says it's a female. I haven't gotten to the point where I can identify them at all. But yeah, it's just a female because Heather has identified it as a female. Sometimes the females are bigger, they might have a different color pattern, like in birds, we're used to that they have different patterns, the same with females. And if you go to state fair, they always have the honeybees out and you can go look for the queen and the workers. The next bee is called the cellophane bee. It's not up there. She is not a specialist. And she was not studied, so there's no ranking. So my feeling is if they didn't study them, they probably didn't think it was a problem, or there were so few they couldn't. So again, these pictures, this is a female and that's a male. So can we tell a difference? I can't visually, I don't know. And this one shows her, a female coming out of the nest. And then we have a picture of them mating. So then we're going to move on to the bumblebees. And most of us know a bumblebee because they're the big fat fuzzy thing that flies around, makes all that noise. The bumblebee, remember when I showed you that they were on the same level as honeybees? The bumblebees are what they call eusocial. They do live in a group. So they are not single moms, they're in a group. They're very organized, and some bumblebees are endangered. They're excellent pollinators, and they use what's called buzz pollination. Now, buzz pollination is when the bee can't really get down to the pollen, so they buzz, or they vibrate their muscles, and they get the pollen. Interestingly, tomatoes have to be buzz pollinated. Honeybees can't pollinate a tomato. So when they started growing tomatoes in greenhouses, they couldn't use their honeybees to pollinate them. So they devised all sorts of different ways to get these to pollinate. They would shake them, they would blow fans on them, trying to get the tomatoes to pollinate. And then they discovered that they could manage bumblebees and use bumblebees. And if we have time, we could talk about the sad story of that, but we'll just leave it at that right now. So remember I showed you the life tree of the common bumblebee? This bumblebee is not a specialist, is a generalist. He's not a specialist, just like the honeybees, which means they can go to any flower they want to, and they're secure. This particular one is secure. So the bumblebee, the queen establishes the colony, she lays eggs, and in the spring she comes out, she sets up the nest, she lays the eggs, and she hatches them, and they feed. The first batch of eggs that hatch become worker bees, and they take over the nectar and pollen collection for the queen. So now she can just devote herself to laying eggs, and the worker bees will come in and they do all sorts of housekeeping. You know, they remove the dead things and all the things that have to be done in keeping a house, and the queen can lay eggs. I think I got ahead. Well, one of the things I thought was interesting is the workers can provide air conditioning or heat for the hive too. So if the hive gets hot, they'll flap their little wings to cool it off. In the late summer, the queen lays eggs which will hatch into males and females. And the queens will grow large and they'll mate. So these mate in the fall. The males leave the nest and look for queens to mate. And during the autumn and winter, the hive will die away. The males will die. And these new queens will have to hibernate, or dysphagia, they call it, over the winter. And they often do this in leaf litter. So if you have bumblebees and other critters hiding in your leaf litter, and you get that all up and put it in bags in the fall, you're probably picking up some bumblebees. So leave leaves on the ground. So here's some pictures of a bumblebee. I actually took that in my friend's garden on her coneflower, and Jan took this one, just the other one. And one of her other master gardeners, Jan Goodenberry, took this. So a very common bumblebee. All three of us found it. Then we have the two-spotted bumblebee, which is also apparently secure. And this is the picture of her or him, I'm assuming a her, taken by Jan. And then this one, this is the queen, and that one's a worker. So supposedly the queen's bigger than the worker. And this is a male and a GYM, not sure how to say that, but that's the female that has not yet become a queen. It's like princess. And then we have the lemon cuckoo bumblebee. And I didn't make this connection, but I guess the cuckoo bird will lay her eggs in other birds' nests. So this bee, which is vulnerable or imperiled and is not a specialist, she doesn't collect pollen. They have reduced body hair. They don't collect pollen, but they do pollinate because they go from flower to flower to get nectar for themselves to eat. So they pollinate, but they don't really collect the pollen. They're thick and tough for a reason, and they're cloak and dagger bees. So the reason we say that is a cuckoo bumblebee will come to a nest that's thriving, and she'll hang out and she'll look at it. And then she might go in and case it out. And as long as there's a lot of workers getting the pollen and taking care of it, and the queen's laying eggs, she will attack the queen and kill it. Get rid of it. And then she'll start laying eggs, and those workers will continue to bring in pollen and take care of the hive. So now we have a hive not full of the original bumblebees, but with these impersonators. And again, the larvae will develop, the cuckoo larvae will develop, they'll mate, males will dive off, and the females will hibernate. So it's the same kind of life cycle, but they don't really do any work. So here's a picture that Jan took. And these are a male and a female.
The male has longer wings, it looks like.
Yeah, but it could be a perspective thing.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, that's another talk. And then we have mason bees, and someone started talking about bees. They're small to medium bees. They're often blue or metallic, although the pictures I have don't show that. They again are solitary. They're single moms. They nest in hollow stems or tunnels that from other insects, or tunnels from other insects, and they use mud to construct their nest. So they need to have mud available to do their nest, and they're effective early spring pollinators. And so one is the blue orchard bee. This is the bee that is become a managed bee in many cases, which means that just like people have a honeybee hive or whatever, they manage these blue orchard bees and they take them to California and they are responsible for pollinating most of the almond in California, which I guess is most of the almonds for the world, which I didn't realize that California was such a large almond producer. One of the problems with having a managed bee and moving them around is you keep introducing these bees to other bees, and they have the possibility of having some kind of a disease or something that will affect the other bees, the non-affected bees. So to end the life cycle, the spring, these emerge and mate in the spring, a little different from the bumblebees. They prepare their nests, they lay the eggs, they incubate, and they have a dormancy over the winter. Again, during the short period of time that the orchard needs to be pollinated, they're out there doing that. And if you think about it, how long do you see flowers in an orchard? So that's the time that this adult bee is busy doing the nest preparation and the pollen development and that, and then it's over. It's just dormancy for the rest of the year. So when you're looking for native bees, you may not see them all year long. It's specific kind. So here's pictures of the blue orchard bee. We have a female and a male. And in this picture, the male looks bigger, but I think it's all perspective. And this is how they nest. They nest in a tube. And the managed bees, they have like a box, and they'll put they'll drill a hole in it and put that layer down. And I guess the hole is drilled so that it's cut in half, so you can lift it up and you can see the bee in there. And so this, I'm assuming, is when it was opened up. And I don't know what these little things are, but I think they might be some kind of mites or parasite. I have no idea. But you can see here, the larvae is feeding on the pollen, and they're all inside that little tube. This is the reason we want to leave hollow stems out so our bees have a place to live. They
Like what do you mean by hollow stems? Like what would be
Hollow?
an example?
Can we save that question for the end, please?
Oh, okay.
I had a picture. I missed the whole slide. Oh, well. I guess on that slide, I have a slide of where bees live. And one of the things about these bees that nest in these tubes is a lot of places sell bee houses. In fact, I was in Korea in 2018 before I knew anything about bees. And I remember taking pictures of these blocks of wood that had all these tubes in them, thinking, what are they doing here? They were bee houses. But you have to be very careful if you're going to have a house, because the female eggs are laid first and then the male eggs are laid. So you have a tube, and so the mother will have female, 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 and then a bunch of males. But if your tubes are too short, there might not be enough males, because she'll run out of tube before she runs out of eggs. Also, someone asked me that they put one of these houses out and it looks blocked off. Well, that's what she does. She, in between every egg, she puts some mud up and she blocks it off. So then in the spring, the males will dig through their mud and fly and so on, and they'll just all come out. So they kind of emerge in the opposite order that they were laid, which is amazing that there's that kind of design. Also, I found this in a seed catalog, you can actually order the little larvae, or not larvae, the pupas of these bees and have your own little bee colony. One of the books I read was really interesting, and she goes in that she had bought 20 of these, and she goes through how she's trying to take care of them. But they'll open up those houses and take out the bees and keep them in the refrigerator so they don't have any problem of being attacked by predators. Another thing about the bee houses is it's suggested that you don't get a really big one because that's like putting out a sign to the predators. Here's where the bees are. It's better to have a bunch of small ones scattered around. But you can't be too far from the flowers that they're pollinating because many of the bees don't fly very far. Okay, we have leafcutter bees. These are medium dark bees, and they cut neat little ovals in the leaf. Last fall, I sent a picture to Jan before I was doing this talk, and I said, "What happened to my red bud?" And she goes, "Well, that's a leafcutter bee." Of course, I don't have the photo, but my red bud just had all these beautiful little scallops all the way around it. So they don't really harm the plant, and they use the leaves to line their nests, and they're important pollinators. So one is the bellflower resin bee, and it's not marked as a specialist, but from its name, you would think it did bellflowers. And again, the life cycle is pretty much the same for a solitary bee. You have an egg, a larvae, a pupa that overwinters. Then the adults come, emerge with the females provisioning and the males focusing on mating. So here's some pictures. We have a female and we have a male. And here is a leafcutter bee coming out. They also use tubes. And then the leafcutter bee cutting a leaf. So this, remember when we looked at the other bee, we could see the bee in there. This is completely encased in that leaf that they've cut. So they just wrap the baby egg and the pollen up in a little tiny cocoon, and they put them in the tubes. I was reading in Europe, they have leafcutter bees. Well, they're cutter bees, but they cut from flower petals, and then they line their nests. So they had pictures of the nests, and they were like a red lining if they had done poppies. It was really pretty. And again, the more you read, it's just amazing. So here is, you can see the female there. And then we have sweat bees. And I remember sweat bees as a kid. They were always the little ones that you got in your elbow and went like that, they'd sting you. But they're not going to sting you unless you go like that. They're really gentle. So they're small, often metallic green or bronze, and they're attracted to our sweat. They also nest in the soil or rotting wood. They are important pollinators of small flowers. And in this case, some of them are solitary and some are eusocial. So some will be a single mother and others will be more like the bumblebees. So the one we're going to look at is the ligated flower furrow bee. And okay, we get the female and the male. And got one on the daisy that Jan took, and one showing it coming out of the ground. Now, how did Jan know that this was a leafcutter bee? So when I was talking to Jan about this, she said, well, you use an app called Seek, and you can take the picture of a bee or a plant or anything, basically, and it will help identify it. So it's very handy. And then from Seek, you can load it to another app called iNaturalist, and that has people all over the world that will help identify the animal or whatever you sent in. We'll probably talk about that more. So here's a leafcutter bee, or I'm sorry, sweat bee. And these Jan took right out by where the cow is. was. Is she out there now?
Yeah.
Out in the lawn. So that shows they don't need a large area because there's lawn out there, but right around the edge of the cow, there was enough soil that was soft enough that they could dig these little holes. So when you see a hole in the ground like that, that's perfectly round, probably could be a bee. One place I read that if you put like a net over it, you can see what's coming out, but then let it go. So this is a male, and that's a female of the sweat bee. And you can see they have the metallic color to them. So why do native bees matter? Well, they're very efficient pollinators for our native plants. And like we talked about with the tomatoes, they're about the only ones who can do it. They're crucial for biodiversity. We don't just want honeybees. We want to have a lot of different kinds of bees. They're adapted to our local climate and seasonal changes. And in some cases, the native bees do the majority of the pollination, even when honeybees are present. Someplace I read, it says we're saving the wrong bees because honeybees, they do have problems. They have the colony collapse and that, but they also have people who are invested in taking care of them, where the native bees are pretty much on their own. So what are threats to native bees? Well, we have habitat loss. So when you look out and see large monoculture agriculture, and I'm a farmer's wife, so I am not against agriculture, but you can know that the bee who needs a specific flower, if it isn't corn, they're not going to find what they need. And also lawns, they're the same. They're the same thing as a big field of corn. A big lawn is all grass and nobody benefits from it. Pesticides. If you spray pesticides, they are not very discriminatory. They will kill almost anything they come in contact with. Competition with non-native species, which is kind of the honeybee, and invasive non-native plants. For a specialist bee, if you have a lot of non-native plants around, they're not going to be able to use it. And climate change. So how can you help? So this was March 10th at my neighborhood. So I went out and I took pictures, and there's not a lot of flowers. This happens to be my yard. I have been accused of being a messy gardener by my neighbors, anonymously. So then I took pictures and I was all excited because I had bees. So I took these 2 pictures and I showed them to Jan. I said, look, I have bees. She goes, they're honeybees. Because winter aconite and
Snowdrops.
what is it?
Snowdrops.
Snowdrops are both not invasive, but they aren't native plants. So we have non-native plants that are early, and we have honeybees that are hanging around, and I don't know where they came from on these non-native plants. So how can you help? Plant native plants that bloom in early spring to late fall. Because all these bees have different life cycles, we need to have flowers blooming all the time. You can't just have a lot of flowers in the summer and then nothing in the fall. You need to leave a little bit of ground bare for nesting, like we had around the cow out here, because if you have a digger bee, they're going to need a spot to nest. And let your garden be a little bit messy. Leave the stems. Someplace I read that when you have like cone flowers, the first winter you should leave the cones, the flowers, for the birds to get the seeds. And then you should cut those heads off and let the flowers grow up amongst those old stems. The bees can use those old stems to lay their eggs. And then the next, and then when the bees are done with them, they'll be old and they'll rot away. And it's just a continuation. Snags, an old log or old snag in a tree. If they're safe, leave them because the bees can use them. And leaves, like we talked about with the honeybee, the bumblebees, they overwinter in them. Wood piles, any place where the bees can hide. And avoid pesticides. And I can't remember why that one's special, but must be really bad. And as I talked about before, the bee houses for mason bees, use them with caution. Now, I did get on a website where someone was selling the houses and he was telling how bad other people's houses were. But what he said made sense. He was talking about the ones that are decorative and real short. Because if you look at a stem of a coneflower plant, it's like this long. It's not that long. So how can you help? So after I found out that, my bees were not native bees, and Jan told me about the seek, I went around my backyard and I started taking pictures of plants to see if I had any plants that were native, because I wanted to have a native plant. So the eastern carpenter bee is attracted to this plant. Oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Eastern carpenter bee, these are the big ones that you see around your house, and they're putting holes in your house and you're not happy with them. But you don't have to kill them. We can just provide a friendly alternative for them. In fact, the males will hover outside the nest because he's protecting from those cuckoo bees that are coming. So if you leave unpainted or weathered wood, and they typically avoid hardwood, fill any gaps or depressions, but make sure the bees are gone. So if you find a hole in your, porch, wait till the bees are gone and fill it in. They suggest putting steel wool in there. Also, their bees don't like wasps. So you can take I don't know if this works, but it was suggested you take a brown paper bag and blow it up and wrinkle it and kind of hang it. And so they'll think it's a wasp nest. Also, they don't like certain smells and they don't like noise. So hang up some wind chimes or put some eucalyptus scent out. Those things will deter them without killing them. So here's your eastern carpenter bee. Well, anyways, seems like I've skipped over slides or they got lost. I found this plant and I looked it up on Seek, and then I looked it up on iNaturalist, and it told me that there is a specialist carpenter bee, a little carpenter bee, that is attracted to this plant. And I can't remember the name of it. It's packeroid.
It's golden ragwort.
Golden
it's
ragwort.
Pecora aurea, probably.
Yeah. So this is going to be in plant sale. So you can come, there's 3 of them that I dug up. But this plant is a native plant that is attractive to a native bee. So what can we do to get involved? And the big thing right now is citizen science. So there's GNB, stands for ground nesting bee, and it's a grant that Cornell is operating, and it's worldwide, and it focuses on native ground nesting bees. And if you go to their website, which is gnb.ny or .org, you'll learn about all the things that they do. They do identification. They also link into iNaturalist. So all these things become interrelated as you work with them. The New York State Department of Environmental, they do protection. The Thruway from the New York State Office of General Services is doing a pollinator, and they say that there's a pollinator garden right by the Batavia exit. I haven't seen it, but I think there's 3 or 4 through the state. It was mentioned to me that if you have a bunch of bees by the Thruway and they fly into cars, that's not a good thing. Also, pollinator pathways. If you Google pollinator pathways, there's one that's in New York City, and people are planting gardens and trying to plant them next door or somewhat close to each other. So the bees have a pathway, just like a walking trail. Mm-hmm. So native bees are everywhere in Western New York. We often don't notice them. They quietly go about doing their business, and we can learn to recognize and support them. We can help not only bees, but the entire ecosystem. Native bees are tiny. one bush or clump of perennials is all it takes to foster a native bee in your yard. So don't think you have to have 5 acres in order to help. Just putting up a little bit. I mean, I probably have 5 by 10 square feet of this going in my garden. So within a mile of your yard, there's bees looking for the right plants. And next time you see a bee in their yard, there's a good chance that it's not a honeybee, but it's a native species that is here longer than we have, or the honeybees. So,
Thank you, Annette.
questions?
Before we take questions, yeah, let's give Annette a hand. Before we take questions, I am gonna shut off the recording just because then sometimes we get a little off track. Let me just end the recording.
Look at all these notes I